Okay, welcome everybody. It's very difficult to believe that just 10 years ago, the City Institute was really just a gleam in the eye of a few urban scholars here at York. Tricia Wood from Geography, Engin Eisen from Urban Studies, and Roger Kyle from the Faculty of Environmental Studies. They were responsible for thinking up the original idea of the City Institute, for initiating a city seminar series, and then in 2006, chartering the City Institute. And in the 10 years since, the City Institute's mandate has been to facilitate critical and interdisciplinary and collaborative urban research and to promote dialogue on Canada's urban agenda here at York, in the GTA, and nationally and globally. And while research is of prime importance to our members, intervention in urban public policy and community activism, both locally and globally, are also very salient aspects of our mandate. Our research agenda is constantly expanding, and we've housed a large number of SHIRK and other funded projects at the Institute. City is in fact now one of the few globally recognized centers doing research on suburban environments. Geographically, Toronto and the GTA have been major foci of our research. European cities have also formed a significant component of City's research agenda, and more recently there's been a significant move to engage with research in the urban global south, to encompass a research profile that includes, for example, issues of suburban land, governance and infrastructure, urban water provision, research on socialist cities, research on the feminization of urban poverty, and engagement with urban theory. And in fact, a number of members of the audience, myself included, have just emerged from a 2-day engagement on issues of urban theory dealing with the concept of planetary urbanization. Is urbanization a process that now has a planetary reach? It took us 2 days to come to an understanding of that question. And when we're not engaged in research, we're busy doing dissemination. We have 3 different seminar series at the City Institute. We have a flagship monthly city seminar series. As part of the SHIRK-funded grant on global suburbanisms, we have a series of talks called Suburban Talks. We also have an ad hoc City Talks. And we've also held a large number of conferences and workshops with various partners on topics such as transit planning for higher education institutes, working with the NDP on urban policy and on their white paper for national urban policy, and of course again on the suburban land question. As part of our efforts to create community, we have a newly minted student caucus, and we've just embarked on an annual 2-day workshop engaging in issues of professional development for early career researchers. And perhaps somewhat unusually for a research institute, we've also made a direct contribution to teaching activities. So Alison Bain and myself are finishing a humongous undergraduate textbook project for Oxford University Press on urbanisation in a global context that highlights the research of Canadian urban researchers. Roger Kyle and Uta Lehrer have held critical planning workshops for graduate students in Montpellier and in Leipzig, and they've held undergraduate courses on urban infrastructure in Toronto, in Montreal, in Vancouver, and in Winnipeg, and they've provided opportunities for over 100 students to engage in fieldwork. We're also part of a major international graduate student training program entitled The World in the City, Metropolitanism and Globalization from the 19th Century to the Present, that's funded through the German Research Society. And that supports the exchange of PhD students between Berlin, New York, and Toronto-based universities. We've also participated in the exchange of students and faculty with the geography department at Goethe University in Frankfurt. So as a result of all of those activities, we often have a great mix of visitors at the City Institute as well. And City's also undertaken proactive engagement with public policymakers, with local governments, with NGOs, with communities within the GTA. And a number of city associates have engaged, for example, in community outreach in neighbouring communities, such as University Heights, better known to us as Jane Finch. And we've just been working with Wanda McNevin, I saw her in the audience there, from Jane Finch, developing a community response to the Toronto Strong Neighbourhood strategy that we hope is going to go places. And City's presence in the GTA community of policymakers and of activists was further bolstered by the formation in 2010 by Roger of the Greater Toronto Suburban Working Group. So I hope it can be said that we're never satisfied to rest on our laurels. We successfully rechartered a couple of years ago. We've just submitted an application for a large SHIRK partnership grant, and our goals for the coming year involve developing a fundraising plan for $5 million so that we can continue to fund more visitors to City and continue to develop our research agenda. So we spend time searching for money, but we also spend a lot of time building up community of future researchers, because I would argue that without that, the money's somewhat pointless. And we might not all agree where we stand on the issue of planetary urbanisation, but I think we're all of the same view that our mandate absolutely has to include producing the next generation of urban researchers. So let me turn to this evening. We have a number of folks who I have to thank, so please bear with me, and for whom we have gifts as well. Let me start by thanking the people who funded this evening, without whom we wouldn't be here. Well, actually, we probably would be here, but the food wouldn't be here. The Office of Vice President, Research and Innovation, both of our sponsoring faculties, the Faculty of Environmental Studies, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Research and Events Fund, the Departments of Geography and Anthropology, and last but not least, my own department, the Urban Studies Programme. I also want to thank our moderator, Jane Farrow, a good friend of City, and our speakers for the evening, Ranu Basu, David Miller, Angela Robertson, Doug Saunders, and Councillor Kristen Wong Tam. And I can't forget the members of the band, of course, Roger Kyle, Tricia Wood, Gail Fraser and Cara Cello. And to those who've helped organise the evening, Doug Young, Lam Hai, Stefan Kipfer, Shubhra Gururani, Gokburu Tanyalditz and Alison Bain. Thank you all so much. I also want to thank our very dedicated administrator, Sarah MacDonald, who keeps us all on the straight and narrow, and she's very ably abetted. Yep. She's very ably abetted by our new administrator as well, Annika Waddell, and we also have Madhu Tavera, who is our photographer of the evening. We have grad students who have been helping, Cara Chalou, Michael Collins, Pierre DeRoy, Michael DeFabo, Linda Karjalian, Jenny Luger, Lucy Lynch, Lauren March, Faraz Retha, and Laura Waddell. And finally, I'd just like to thank those folks who've worked at City over the years. To Shubhra Gururani for stepping in as director in 2009, for Alison Bain, who's the interim director in this academic year. But I want to end by saying a few words about the two people who've been keeping the City Institute going since its inception. Sarah MacDonald, as I said, has been the administrator of the City Institute since it started, and she is absolutely, totally dedicated to her work. She goes way beyond the terms of her employment. Don't tell the union. She ensures that our grants are submitted on time. She makes sure we stay on the right side of SHIRK and the finance department. She makes sure that our regular schedule events runs very smoothly. She's also been instrumental in supervising graduate assistants and central in helping develop a sense of community at the Institute. So thank you very much, Sarah. And of course, I have to end by talking about Roger, who in 2006 was the first director of the City Institute. And those of you who know him know what a dynamo Roger is. He took the institute in his 6 years at the helm, as I said, from that gleam in his eye to a research centre with a global reputation. His leadership has been truly inspiring, and it's been a huge boost for urban scholars, for York University, and for urban knowledge production worldwide. His ability to generate ideas, to disseminate information, to secure funding, to create community, to make people welcome, from graduate students to world-renowned scholars, is indicative of a reach that very few of us can emulate, and we are so lucky to have him as one of our own, and to have him this evening as our MC. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Well, she's making me cry. Unbelievable. Thank you very much, Linda. I'm done with the speeches, so tonight I don't have to give speeches. I just want to say a few words, acknowledge just a couple of people. And this was founded before. No, this was founded when David Miller was mayor, who is here tonight. This was founded before Matt Callaway knew that he was going to be the urban affairs critic of the NDP in Ottawa, which at some point I hope he has a chance to return to. And this was founded way before the subway was started to be constructed. It's still being constructed. And there's a lot of things that have happened in those 10 years. And I remember that when we went, after the chartering, we went to Paupers. And there were like 3 or 5 of us sitting around a table. The idea, if anybody that night had said, we're going to sit here with 100 people 10 years from now, that would have just been impossible to think, right? So the people I want to acknowledge, really very short, is Tricia. The gleam in the eye, that was hers. It was her initial idea to put to put pressure on the institution, which is very important. And we had the incredible ingenuity of Engen Eisen. And then we started this, and we wrote draft after draft, and we went to urban studies and to environmental studies, geography, and we got all this done. And it was a long process, but we got it done. The most important thing was, and Tricia always pointed it out, it was very important, we needed a space. So we got a little room somewhere, and then we got a little bit of a space. Then we moved into York Lanes in the beginning, and then we got this incredible space. And we were actually, we designed this. That was the working group together with our neighbors here on the 7th floor. We wanted this space. We wanted to have a space where we could have this kind of event. So that worked out quite well. I must say, this is, last thing about me, is that 2 times during that decade of the aughts, I was forced into a work relationship. One was that Alan Harding made me drunk in Monterey, California, and I became the editor of Eiger. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I had signed something. I don't remember what it was. And I was the editor of Eiger for 8 years. And the second thing is that I came to a meeting in urban studies, and there was Engen and Tricia sitting there with stern faces, and they had decided that I was going to be the inaugural director of this thing. So I'm glad that you suggested that. I'm happy that we're still here, and that worked out so well. So acknowledge Engen, Tricia, and most of all, and she already got an applause, but she deserves a second one, is Sarah McDonald. Sarah McDonald. Linda, I'm glad you took this over. Alison, thank you very much for stepping in when we needed you. There's one more person I wanted to acknowledge, Doug Young. Right here, Doug and I. We were here first with all these other people. Laura Lynn. These were the first people in this office that are still here tonight. There were some others, but these are here tonight. We started as 5 of us in a small office. All I'm going to say, you're going to hear more from me in a different mode later today. Be afraid, be very afraid. So what I'm going to do now is introduce the incomparable And I'm glad you said it, friend of the City Institute, Jane Farrow, who has always been a supporter of this outfit. And Jane is going to be doing the second part of this program. She is the Director of Learning and Participation, Mass LBP. Drawing on a strong background in journalism, community organizing, Jane excels at bringing people together for constructive dialogue and creative city-building initiatives. She was the founding director of Jane's Walk, a global movement of free citizen-led walking tours that celebrate urbanist Jane Jacobs' ideas. Is that T-shirt? Yeah, Jane Jacobs T-shirt. Very good. Jane leads the urban practice at Mass LBP and has a deep understanding of the mechanics of community engagement and decision-making, deriving from a broad set of experiences as a researcher, advisor, City Hall staffer, and facilitator. Jane has done consultation, policy and facilitation work of local regional significance with the City of Toronto, Toronto Arts Council, Ontario Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, Metrolinx, York University, Park People, PMA Landscape Architects, Public Work, the Planning Partnership, and the Swearhun Facilitation. Jane.
And I should say that bourbon sours were not actually involved in my enlistment in being a supporter of the City Institute, but I'm open to that on a continuing basis. And it is a real honor to be asked to moderate. It's an illustrious company, so I'm glad to just play a small role. I went to U of T, but I've been invited back many times here back to York University, which is just an incredibly open and rigorous and curious institution. And so it may explain that when I went to register for my first day at U of T, I didn't understand, this is a long, long time ago, that you had to be part of a college. You could be accepted at U of T, but you had to check off which college you wanted to be to. And I was like devastated because I thought they were trying to kick me out on the first day. And I'm like, I don't know what college I want to be in. I don't know. And she looked at me and said, oh, you want to go to York University. So there's a spiritual affinity that I have with this crowd of radical, badass, academic, curious people. So I'm glad to be here. And so I'd like to get on with introducing, I was going to say Mayor Miller, right? I mean, really, he's Mayor Miller, even though he goes by the code name David Miller these days. And I don't even know where to begin, so I'm just going to lay it out pretty straight for now. We have a Q&A to look forward to, and we'll get familiar and rowdy at that time. But as you know, he is known to most of us as the Mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010, and as the chair of the influential C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group from 2008 to 2010. Under his leadership, Toronto became widely admired internationally for its environmental leadership, economic strength, and social integration. He's a leading advocate for the creation of sustainable urban economies and a strong and forceful champion for the next generation of jobs through sustainability. David continues to press forward with all of this work as the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund. He's currently an adjunct professor at York University, so he's part of these merry pranksters up here as well, and a member of the board of directors for Centennial College. So come on up, David. I'll try to adjust.
Thanks very much, Jane, and everyone for that warm welcome. I apologize in advance for my voice, but when spring turned into winter last week, I seem to have been affected. It's my very pleasant duty tonight to try and frame the discussion, Toronto in Crisis, Challenges, Possibilities, and Actions. And I'll try to do that fairly succinctly, but I did want to say a couple of things before I even do that. First of all, congratulations to the City Centre, to its work, to the founders and everybody involved. It's extremely important. It's been important to the City of Toronto, I think, and very important internationally. And the work is tremendous. And now that I'm affiliated with York University, I can enjoy it a bit from the inside. So to everybody who's connected with it in that way, congratulations and thank you for the leadership for the last 10 years. The second thing is I do want to acknowledge Kristen Wong-Tam, City Councillor, and Matthew Kelway. Where'd Matthew go? Over here, former Member of Parliament from Beaches Woodbine. They're both fantastic elected officials. A few years ago, just after ending my term as mayor, I was at a public meeting about something. I think it was to do with the federal government. And people were saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I said, elect the right people. Matthew and Kristen are the right people and make a huge difference. And I want to thank both of you for your work on behalf of the public. So, Toronto in crisis, challenges, possibilities, and actions. And I think this is really great. I was elected for 16 years, involved in municipal politics for 20 years, and never, when I was speaking, was I given this, ever. So I'm my own warning. That's fantastic, Jane. You made a big mistake. That says 50 minutes, in case you're wondering. So what I thought I would do is talk a bit about the strengths of our wonderful city as I see them, and the offsetting weaknesses, and put it slightly in context. We're in the decade, perhaps the century of the city. For the first time in, I think it's 2009, the academics here will tell me if I'm correct, more than half of the population of the world lived in urban areas. Was it 2009? You're all looking. 2008? 2009, there we go. They said depend how you count, but that's from a reporter, so who knows what that means. That is a fundamental change in the world. You know, from time immemorial till 6 or 7 years ago, more people lived rural agrarian lives than lived urban lives. And from 6 or 7 years ago, apparently forever, because the trend is increasing in China and India, particularly in China, more people are going to live urban lives. That, first of all, makes the work of this center exceptionally important, and their colleagues in other institutions. But secondly, it has profound implications for how we think about our governments, our governance, and the kind of public policies we believe in, and how we address our challenges. So, for example, Jane mentioned that I was chair of the influential C40 group from 2008 to 2010. That was 40 of the world's largest cities that came together originally under the leadership of Ken Livingstone of London, because they believed that national governments were not acting sufficiently on climate change. And the group had two purposes. One was a political one, to force national governments to act, and their influence and others resulted in the Paris Agreement last year. Extremely important. The second was to actually act, to show that there were solutions to climate change. And all 40 of those cities were making tremendous strides on climate change. And depending how you cut the figures, one could ascribe about 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions to our urban areas. It's a fair calculation. That's the one the C40 uses. And the fact is that the C40 cities are showing that it's actually possible to combat climate change through effective policies and actions while ensuring that people still have decent employment and jobs, in fact, better employment and jobs. In Toronto's case, for example, thanks to policies that the City of Toronto brought in 2007 and to the closing of coal-fired plants by the province of Ontario, the greenhouse gases in the Toronto geographic area are now 20% below 1990 levels. 20%. So when sometimes I read people say, we can't fight climate change without ruining our economy, I say that's complete nonsense. You know, just look at what cities are doing. Well, that kind of action and public policy change is a dramatic change from what might have occurred 20 or 30 years ago. When we've combated other global environmental issues, the public policy has been led by national governments. And we've now seen this change, and I think it has profound implications for other areas. And some of the things that I saw when I was mayor, I think we're going to see the same trend of city-led solutions with national governments often in a supporting role. And we're certainly seeing that internationally with increasing urbanization. So in Toronto, for example, we have an incredible city. You know, I chose to live in Toronto when we immigrated from England. My mom and I lived in Ottawa. If anybody else here lived in Ottawa in the late 1960s, you'll know why I didn't stay there. Exciting would not be the word you would ascribe to Ottawa. Cold would be a word. And I came to Toronto for law school and for a job and for success, like many people. And I fell in love with the city. And the first thing I loved, it's probably a little bit trite if you follow my political history, were the streetcars. I lived in Parkdale, and I took the streetcar to the University of Toronto. I'm sorry, I have to admit, I attended the University of Toronto for law school. I just loved it. I love this city. And I think we've got an incredible city, a city we should be really proud of. What is fantastic about Toronto? Well, there's a variety of things, and I'm just going to pick a few, but I think, because I think these ones really matter. The first is that compared to most places in the world, we have figured out how to welcome people from different backgrounds and different countries and ensure that they have a real part to play in the lives of the city. And it's not tolerance, which what I see when people say tolerance is, oh, there's people that aren't like me, I'm going to put up with them. It's a real sense of inclusion and welcome. And it's not perfect, but compared to many places, it's quite remarkable. Last week, for example, we saw a protest of people protesting the Minister of Immigration because we weren't, as a country, bringing in Syrian refugees fast enough. Now, could you imagine that protest occurring at a Donald Trump rally in Wisconsin, or a Ted Cruz rally, or any of the other people running for President of the United States of America in the Republican Party, the party that ended slavery? We couldn't imagine that conversation occurring. Yet that happened right here in Toronto. It wasn't even remarkable. The biggest response is, why aren't they bringing them faster? What's wrong with our government? But if you compare it with what's going on in Europe today, for example, it's really remarkable. And that's a special, special thing, something we should be really proud of and value and nurture. Second thing that's very important about Toronto and a real strength is our economic strength. There is a real strength to the economy here. We are the world capital of mining finance. Now, there may be people who have some concerns about mines and the way they're done, but we happen to be the world capital, right? It's a pretty significant thing. And if we learn how to do that properly, we can actually export the knowledge to the rest of the world because most of them are financed here in Toronto. Our financial services industry, our IT industry, a number of others are incredible strengths here. And we still have a manufacturing industry, mostly based in food, but there's 20-odd thousand people working in the auto parts industry who live in Toronto. So we have economic strengths. We've got cultural strengths through this diversity, economic strengths, we've got environmental strengths. If you look at Toronto from the air on a map, what you see is the ravines, these beautiful green spaces. And they, of course, came about because of Hurricane Hazel, 1954, in which dozens of people were killed because we were building houses in the ravines. So it wasn't some prescience. We actually learned from experience and said, oh, you know what, we've got to do better. And the province created laws that prevented development in the ravines, but it now marks Toronto. And one of the things that I realized when I was mayor, when our climate change strategy passed City Hall unanimously, and the room was full, and everybody who served with me, who served after me, was in the room that day, what I realized was Torontonians in every neighborhood are environmentalists, because otherwise you couldn't get a unanimous vote on a policy like that. It would be impossible in a democratic forum like City Council. And we have very strong cultural strengths. There's a great sense of culture and great cultural institutions. So, and we have a pretty good local government. There's been times I might have disagreed with the leadership of it, but we have a pretty good local government. So those are our strengths. What are the challenges? Well, I think the first challenge is that all of the things I just mentioned are fraying. First of all, our ability to include and welcome people from all backgrounds, all places, and all economic classes is fraying. And I think it's a Canadian value to think of ourselves as a place of relative equality. Wayne Gretzky, the second greatest hockey player of all time after Bobby Orr, was not voted the greatest Canadian. That was the founder of Medicare, Tommy Douglas. He was voted to be the greatest Canadian. It's a Canadian value, this sense of relative equality, and that's fraying. And it's fraying seriously. And there have been strong efforts led by the City Government, United Way, and others through strong neighborhoods, priority neighborhoods when I was mayor, to try to combat this, to put the investments where they should be, where people need them the most. But we're still a city where there are neighborhoods marked by a very strong correlation between low incomes, a lack of opportunity, and a lack of public services and public investments. And if we don't correct that, there are really serious consequences for this city. We're a city with a strong economy, but it's an economy that's not shared. If you go to those same neighborhoods and talk to people, you will discover they're working 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table. And often those jobs are all over the city. We're a city that once upon a time had a great transit system, but it has not kept up with the growth of the city. It's a very significant challenge. We have a city that prided itself on being a place where people from all income backgrounds could live in all neighborhoods. Not only is that no longer true, the sprawl to the northeast and west of us has really made it challenging to think of what is this city, where are the pockets of poverty, how do we address them from a planning perspective, and how do we solve the economic challenges caused by sprawl. And I think all of this comes about in part because of a bit of a lack of inclusion from a democratic perspective. So I said that from my perspective, our city government works pretty well. I was certainly proud of council while I was mayor. I think council did a terrific job. We brought in place numerous strategies that were implemented that made a very real difference in the everyday lives of people. But there is one challenge with the city government in this city today, and that is very significant numbers of people feel distant from it. They feel distant from it partly because of the lingering effects of amalgamation, a different political culture in Scarborough from Etobicoke, from North York, from Toronto. That still lingers 20 years later. It still lingers. They also feel distant from it because if you go to the neighborhoods that are marked by concentrations of poverty, they're also marked by people who are either practically or legally excluded from the democratic process. So for example, when we were doing public consultations about the light rail transit plan known as Transit City, just before we started construction on the Shepherd line. Oh, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Finch Avenue LRT was ready to be built in 2010 and will be up and running by now if it hadn't been stopped. It's nothing to do with my thesis or the remarks, but I just had to mention that because it's coming now. There's a community benefits agreement. It's supposed to start construction in 2017, but if you care about transit access here beyond the subway to this university, keep the pressure up because I've watched it slip and slip and slip. Anyway, when we were doing public consultations, I took the bus from Malvern to York, actually, the buses. And there was a woman that was on 2 of the buses I took, and I gave her the pamphlet, and she said, well, what's an LRT? And I said, it's a European-style tram. It runs down the middle of the street in its own right-of-way. Great thing about it is it comes on time every 5 minutes, and it's much faster than the bus because it doesn't get stuck in rush hour traffic. She said, that's great. That would help me so much. I said, why would it help you? Where are you going? She said, work. I said, where do you work? This is in Malvern. She said, Pearson Airport. I said, that's a long way. How do you get there? She said, well, I took the Malvern bus, then the Shepherd bus, and then the subway, and then the subway, and then the Finch bus, and then the airport bus. I said, that must take a long time. She said, yeah, it's 2 hours and a half if I make my connections. And in the winter, sometimes it's hard to make your connections. Now, that person, imagine her inability to participate. Oh, and I said, that's a long day. And she said, I said, it must be a tough trip home. She said, well, that's my morning job. My afternoon job, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel. So bus, subway, 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 bus. So she takes something like 7 or 9 buses a day, all these subway trips. 4 or 4.5 hours a day. It is impossible for her physically to be home at dinner with her family. It's impossible for her physically to take some extra courses so she can work only one job. And it's completely impossible for her to go out to community meetings to participate in the discussion about transit. And there's been a healthy debate in Toronto. You know, should we have an entire network of LRTs serving all the low-income neighborhoods across this city? Or should we have one stop of subway in Scarborough, is the way I would characterize the debate. As you can see, I come down on the side of serving the lowest income people in the city. But this woman who was really captured by the idea of the Shepherd LRT had no chance to participate in the debate because she was always stuck on the bus, literally. And there's an allied problem to that. And that is, in many of these lower income neighborhoods, many of the people who live there are also relatively new Canadians who are landed immigrants or permanent residents but haven't become citizens. They don't have a vote in municipal elections. And you can you can see a direct line from that inability to vote and or the inability to participate in the democratic process, like the woman I spoke to the fact that those neighborhoods have their needs met the least often. And I think that's an extremely serious problem in Toronto. Look at the transit debate today. There was an article in the newspaper yesterday about the downtown relief line. Nice project. Who does that serve? That makes transit better for people who are already on the Bloor subway or the Yonge subway. It does nothing for people who live at Jane and Finch, does nothing for people in Malvern, does nothing for people in Rexdale. And what's entirely possible to happen is that the infrastructure needs of those who do have the vote and a voice and who live in neighborhoods where they can go out to community meetings will be met, and those who don't won't. And we'll be perpetuating that cycle of Toronto that is extremely risky and negative. Now, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because there are people who have goodwill who are going to fight to make sure that won't happen. I'm optimistic because there are excellent city councillors like Kristen and Gord Perks and Shelley Carroll who understand this in their bones. They're going to fight to make sure that the needs of lower income people, not just transit, housing, others, are met. But it's also something we need to be honest about. You know, the province tabled legislation today changing the voting system in municipalities. Not even a hint of a discussion of allowing permanent residents to vote. It's almost like it's verboten. And we have to be incredibly careful, in my view, in this wonderful and magical city that really has some special things to show the world, that we don't lose those special things. And it starts by being a city where everyone has a real part to play in the life of that city. And that is a democratic issue, and it's an economic issue, and it's an issue of welcoming. And that's the Toronto we can be at our best. I hope that's the Toronto we stay. And I also hope what I've just said has something to do with setting the stage for the panel. I look forward to hearing the remarks. Thank you very much, and Jane, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks. I think we should probably invite the panelists up here to sit at this time, and there will be presentations from them. Short presentations, approximately 10 minutes each. And then there will be a Q&A with the audience. So take the stage, storm the barricades. Here we go. Grab a seat, and we're going to hear first from Ranu Basu. I'll introduce Ranu once you get into your chairs here. And yeah. So Ranu Basu is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at York University. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with Ranu. And her research and teaching interests relate to the geographies of marginality, diversity, and social justice in cities. She's explored such areas as the impacts of educational restructuring, multiculturalism in schools, and the provision of infrastructure for marginal groups in suburban regions. She serves on the executive board of the Center for Refugee Studies and previously with the City Institute. Most recently, she's embarked on a project entitled Subalterity, Education and Welfare Cities that traces the geopolitical relationship of cities and schools through questions of conflict and displacement in Havana, Toronto, and Kolkata. And that sounds like an awesome research circuit if I ever heard one. So please welcome Ranu Basu.
Thank you, Jane. Everyone, for being here. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the City Institute for organizing this fantastic event and also celebrating a decade of critical scholarship, intellectual exchange, community engagement, and lasting friendships, very much the core of the center. I also wish to acknowledge, especially given our discussion on Toronto, the ancestral, unceded Aboriginal territories of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe peoples, and in particular the Mississaugas of the New Credit Nation, First Nation on whose territory we stand. The topic of today's forum is Toronto in Crisis, Challenges, Possibilities, and Actions, and I base my comments through the lens of critical geographies of education and counter public spaces, primarily migrant public spaces in Toronto. So why these two themes? As an urban social political geographer, it is through these themes that I've gained an understanding of processes such as the underlying structures and practices related to exclusion, dispossession, and displacement in cities, subalterity and the spatialities of justice as they also relate to forced and displaced migrants, the unrelenting persistence of neoliberal governmentality, tensions between rationality and power in the politics of redistribution and recognition, state-based policies and the strategies of resistance and solidarity movements. These topics provide deep insights into the more complex interactions between space, power relations, and civil society. For subaltern communities with unique needs and vulnerabilities, state spaces of education has never been more critical to unpack in an era of continued neoliberal restructuring, simultaneously characterized by global unrest, conflict, violence, and increased mobility. But most importantly, these spaces are also sites of continuous struggle and resistance. There are three heuristically interrelated themes that continue to perplex and trouble me, not because I'm naive enough to believe, as Bell Hooks would note, that in an imperial, capitalist, patriarchal society, that inequality, sexism, racism, and homophobia are not inherently part of everyday urbanity. But what troubles me is the insidious and complicated nature of its continual reproduction and strategic institutionalization that is in need of serious interrogation in order for us to understand the basis of the multiple and overlapping crises that continue to exist. These broad and interrelated themes very broadly relate to the rationalization of neoliberal discourse, the politics of hypocrisy, and the violence of imperialism. Yet contestation, from the everyday mundane acts of non-compliance and creative resistance to the larger solidarity movements, are vibrant and very much alive in this city. This is the urban landscape of anti-oppression that is grounded in multi-scalar networks of alliances and support and activism. This is a landscape of education that acknowledges the violence and corresponding ethical demands and rights from the Truth and Reconciliation report, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ community, and the refugee crisis. So we have been moving on to the schools and public space challenges. We have been witnessing over a decade now, not only in Canada, but internationally, the neoliberalization of education at multiple scales and contexts. The marketization, privatization, competition, audit cultures, and rapid erosion of the welfare state have strategically and insidiously become normalized discourse. From the retrenchment of crucial social services, school closures, competitive models of testing and ranking of schools, class size increases, crumbling schools, insufficient structure, alongside the problematic quasi-public funding, corporate involvement, increased fundraising, charitable donations, the list is long and complicated and very messy to discern. Such policies and practices morph from place to place across the city, affecting the future prospects of those most disenfranchised, classed, raced, recent migrants, non-status families, and precarious workers. So in the interest of time, I will focus very, very quickly, primarily using visuals and counter-mapping strategies on three examples in Toronto that illustrate, first, a challenge that we've been asked to think about as a retrenched spaces of education as a strategy of exclusion and further marginalization, the hollowing out of spaces in the city. Second, a possibility, and that's through multifarious spaces of engagement as possibilities of hope in producing political and relational spaces. And thirdly, an action, that is the suburban altered cosmopolitanism as radical interventions for change and deeply woven and implicated with the turbulent processes of elsewhere. So not just studying Toronto as Toronto, but studying Toronto from elsewhere as well. So this is, I'm just going to speak now to the slides and move away from the text. But this is the first, the challenge. And so this is a retrenched spaces of education. An example is an old map of school closures. And this map has many, many stories behind it. And in the interest of time, I don't think I can explore all the stories. But the black triangles on the map, 138 schools that were deemed for closure a couple of years ago, are not only schools that were closed, but it was also the hollowing out of civic capacity. And when we think about civic capacity, schools are the only public institution, neighborhood by neighborhood, that have particular kinds of civic capacities, right from parental activities to neighborhood community exchanges, to ESL programs, to settlement services, to health services, public health services, linkages with other schools. These are the only neighborhood by neighborhood public institution that has all these kinds of, not only is it a neighborhood hub, but it's also allows for this kind of civic capacity to be produced. And if you look at the triangle again, the hollowing out of this, the hollowing out of these spaces means that it's not just the educational spaces, but alongside that are all these other community services and the kinds of opportunities that are there. The black triangles also related to, when I did the study a couple of years ago, it was also related to, were more likely in schools that had more higher migrants, low-income areas, offering other settlement services, and less likely in schools where the parents were more able to organize in terms of fundraising and so forth. So even in terms of thinking through civic capacity, it varies. It varies according to, as David Miller, you mentioned, in terms of who's able to participate and who isn't able to participate. And those of qualitative engagements vary school by school. So that's another story in terms of thinking through what these triangles indicate, aside from closure, aside from civic capacity, excuse me, is also how an urban social movement that started that particular time against the school closures, because there's 138 of them at sites, translated into a different project. And so those are the circles and the blue circles and the red circles over. So there was a strategy to change, instead of 138 schools, 10 schools per year over a period of 3 years, and from a site-specific to an area-specific. So I can talk more about this if anyone has more questions. But that was the challenge in terms of thinking about what we already have as public institutions and saving them, to thinking about them more broadly. Moving on to a possibility, and this is really, again, coming back to the school question of what I call the multifarious spaces, reimagining, again, coming back to the question of diversity in Toronto, which is really, really super interesting. And in this map, what I'm trying to indicate, if you could just concentrate on the red circles overlaid over the blue neighborhoods, which is high percentage of migrants and the number of heritage languages offered by schools. Toronto, as we know, as we've just introduced, is a city which is, of course, extremely diverse. And we think about neighborhoods when we map them in terms of, yes, certainly there are areas of particular ethnic groups concentrated in certain parts of the city, but the city has evolved this way too. The city, to me, is not so much this as it is this. It is the dark blue areas where there's more than 8 to 10 different groups in any particular neighborhood living in close proximity that lead to schools offering so many different kinds of languages, over 50 plus languages in the schools. And these are offered by groups of parents organized and community members organizing together with the principals to offer these different languages. And as you can see, the blue, the ones that are highlighted in blue are the top refugee intake countries. And so this shows the different kinds of languages offered in schools. What is interesting here in this part is to show that they're not just offering one language, but there are schools offering more than 10 languages, or 5 to 10 languages per school, and these are the ones with the red circles. And that makes us think about thinking through the question of integration in a very, very different way. I didn't set about starting this project to thinking about the heritage languages offered by school. So if we think about it traditionally in terms of thinking about the question of integration and how that affects space, it can be the traditional one-sided model or a two-sided model where people from their own, depending on their heritage backgrounds, are taking language classes of their ancestors. But it has evolved into a multifarious model in which people are taking various kinds of different kinds of languages because of the proximity and everyday life. So you could have someone who's of Tamil background taking Japanese classes or Spanish classes, and so that And that spills outside the schools into the neighborhood. And the neighborhoods have evolved again very differently. This is a land use map, and the gray areas in the map are old industrial zones. The industrial zones have closed, and many of them look like this across the city. They look bland. They've been stigmatized, particularly this is in Scarborough, have been stigmatized as being a bland kind of landscape and have been redeveloped, a lot of redevelopment also going on there. But when you speak to migrants and some of the work that I did, they think of it very differently. They've been using these spaces differently. They think about it as a city of peace and refuge. They've been using it as a city of memory, desire, imagination, city of integrated multiplicity, and city of fluid resistance. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll show you some examples of what they've done within industrial space. The pictures speak for themselves in terms of the kinds of public spaces that they imagine and use. This is like a transnational space where video transfers, cell phones. Independence Day celebrated on the streets in terms of the Indian Independence Day, how children imagine their neighborhoods, and alternative public spaces very much in terms of the places of worship across the city. And if I haven't, I'm still writing up this paper, but if you overlay this one with the kind of public services that are closed, you'll see an interesting relationship. These are the mosques, again, religious, but they're not just mosques and religious centers, but they're also centers where there's language classes, there's ESL programs, seniors go and visit. There's small scale over the stores, they're large scale, they're in old motels. So these are the spaces that have been taken up. There's flea markets where you have a lot of Muslim women working in their own kind of own stalls and selling and working here as part-time, which is funded by the mosque. You have farmers markets during the summer. So these are the various spaces that exist and have and multifarious spaces that exist in the city of Toronto. Outside it looks bland and many people have chided Scarborough in particular for being, but if you go inside and visit these spaces, they're quite different inside and how they're experienced, and the life of the city is quite. These industrial spaces again are changed, they're painted and made their own. And this is a particular one I wanted to show you. This is a multifarious space that is really, really interesting. It's a Bangladeshi annual festival that takes place in Scarborough, and it takes place in the Canadian Legion. And if you go inside, you can see, of course, this is a picture of Winston Churchill and the Union Jack. But if you go inside, you can see that in closely with the Durga Puja that's going on. So these are spaces that are not just in the schools, but are spilling out into the neighborhoods and the other. This is, again, the Queen with Kali Puja that's going on once a year. And so these are the spaces inside. This is, again, during Eid, how the mosque is lit up. It's lit up next to the Christmas lights. So if you think about not only Kali and the Legion, but you can also think about Eid with Christmas lights. These are the kind of multifarious spaces. Now, to end with a suburban altar and cosmopolitanism as a city of fluid resistance, these spaces are not just spaces for cultural engagement, but they're also a sort of political consciousness that comes about when you are in direct conflict. And so at one point, it could be negative or positive. This is a Lido motel many years ago. There were a lot of Roma refugees who were housed here, and there were a lot of skinheads who protested out of that, and they wanted them out. But that's one of the examples. But the informal can become very formal. And this is a picture from many years ago when Jack Layton was running for elections. His poster was in a Tamil grocery store. And the informal becomes very much formal during his elections. Again, this is in Malvern. You mentioned Malvern, around that area. And this is the group of people that had come out. But there is also this side in terms of thinking about transnational activism. There was protest on the streets. This is in 2009. There's a huge Tamil protest movement that was downtown, but it originated in many of these public spaces. It originated in these grocery stores. It originated in these local schools, and it flew out onto the streets. So you can see the man who said, "Canada, are we silent witness to genocide?" It's fluid. The resistance is fluid. You can see them through the cars with posters. on the corner of the seats of the streets, and people honking and expressing their support, quite like the Black Lives Matter moment that Jennifer will be talking about soon. But it's sort of this cosmopolitan kind of suburban alternate cosmopolitan support that allowed this movement to move further downtown when it took over the Garden Expressway and take over. I'm going to end so I just try to show you the challenge, an example of challenges in Tues schools, the kind of hopefulness, the kind of radical intervention. And this is where we don't want to be, I think. We need to be careful in terms of when we're thinking about planning and modernity, that these spaces, this was a vibrant flea market at one part, it's been shut down for the last, I don't know how many years, still nothing has happened. Lots of people that we don't want to, in terms of thinking about how we plan and design our cities and shape our cities, to be careful in terms of how we rethink these pictures, and that I don't have nothing. I don't have a word to express it, but what these different processes and everyday lives have shared. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ranu. All right, so I have a little goad from some of the organizers that we're going to try to compress things a little bit. Now, because Ranu's presentation was so unbelievably awesome with all the photographs, we gave Ranu an exception to that rule. Of course, Mayor Miller, well, he's got important things to say. He can string it together, but he's going to rely on the last three panelists here to tighten up a bit, because we want to make sure we get the good Q&A. And you see those drinks, those pieces of cheese, regulation Cubo cheese, ready for this party action here. These brainards want to mix it up tonight. Although it is very hard, I have to say, to tell Angela Robinson to not take her time, because really, let's face it, this woman has done a lot of stuff in this city that has an incredible impact. And I'm very much looking forward to Angela's comments. So with all respect, I'd like to say that Angela has helped make a lot of extraordinary things happen in this city as an activist, an organizer, an executive director, an editor, and board member. And she's currently the executive director of Queen West Central Toronto Community Health Centre. Angela's also been a director of health equity at Women's College Hospital and was the executive director of Sistering for over a decade. An activist in the Black, women's, and LGBTQ communities, Angela has added her considerable clout and brains to such organizations as HouseLink Community Homes, the Stephen Lewis Foundation, and the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention. Angela has been recognized for her contributions to social justice issues and advocacy by Now Magazine, the Rubina Willis Women's of Distinction Award, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations Awards, the Fred Victor Center, and the YWCA Woman of Distinction Award for Social Change.
You're eating up my time. So I will echo all of the congratulations. I'll be rapid. I'll echo the congratulations to City for this 10th anniversary. And my remarks will be, I think, a bit of a magnifying of some of the earlier contextual comments offered by David Miller in terms of looking at issues around disparities in this city and what are some of the ways in which we need to see those disparities in order to then enable action and response. I want to also preface that I think cities are closest to the action. They're the closest, I think, point of action and point of engagement and change with communities who are in needs, who have gaps, and who have desire to make change. So I think cities are particularly important as a mobilizing force for folks who are on the ground and who are desiring to have impact. So therefore, why I think this institute is also particularly important. So I want to say thanks to Stefan for, and others of the organizers for inviting me here. They've enticed me with an offer to a no bars or no holds barred, yes, conversation. As an activist and community worker, I found that hard to resist. I will contest some of the language that we talk about the city. So this city, Toronto, is known worldwide and marketed as one of the most livable and multicultural urban spaces in the world, a place where words like diversity, inclusion, prosperity, and opportunity are used, and to talk about what is present and possible for residents in the city. I will seek to trouble this image with my remarks. First, I suggest that the language of diversity obscures the specificity and differential impact of racism. Second, inclusion is seen as a fundamental good, but not for everyone. This is one of the paradoxes, I believe, of inclusion. Inclusion, I believe, can become a form of, I think, political demobilization, in that it suggests that there is an ideal defined space that we should all seek to belong. And we have to then ask or question, who gets to define what that ideal space is that we should seek to belong to? The circle is a shape that appears to be the preferred figuration used by policymakers to symbolize inclusion. This belonging and unbelonging can be visualized when we think about who are inside and outside of this circle of inclusion and why. Where it is signified that inclusion is not for everyone, the not everyone is frequently marked by indigenous identity, by race, by nationality, by gender, by our LGBTQ location, by poverty, by language, by disability. I suggest that for our city of the future, we change the language of diversity and inclusion, as both diversity and inclusion are void of language and actions of resistance and structural critique. And the structural critique that I want to also use later is a structural critique of racism. I also suggest that prosperity and opportunity are not neutral. They are informed by relationships to resources and sites of power and influence. In this city, Toronto, we need to look at some of the realities, and I had a whole list of stats that I would go through, but I'm in a room of academics, so who are doing urban city work, so you know the range of disparities when you look at income, when you look at precarious work, when you look at where poverty is located in the city, and David Miller has identified some of that. One of the pieces that I would also just highlight in this is that we're in a period of immense surge in private condo development. And with this redevelopment, we're seeing displacing of folks who the city has been home. And the city is now becoming an unaffordable site for low-income peoples. So low-income peoples are being moved further and further afield, and you know the David Hochelki's study where you talk about the three cities. And Ranu's diagram just, I think, referenced that as well and anchored that quite nicely. This is a city where we have over 91,000 individuals waiting on the social housing wait list and over 10,000 waiting on the waiting list for supportive housing. The other stats that I will just draw your attention to is around indigenous community, urban indigenous community members, in that urban indigenous community members and Anishinaabe Health, another community health center, a sister organization to the one where I work, did a study in 2014 and identified that indigenous communities who they see, clients who they see, is that there's a premature death for happening among urban indigenous community members who are dying at the rough age of 37 compared to 75 for other average Torontonians, something that should be alarming for us when we think about the question about the crisis of the city. And in terms of David Miller identified issues around poverty and where poverty is located, and we see that in the map. As I share these stats really not to depress you, but really just to draw your attention to the fact that when we talk about disparity, disparity looks a particular way. The hue of disparity also carries a racialized hue, and we need to think about that. I believe that in this city we are clearer in understanding that addressing the social determinants of health and well-being requires collaboration with multi-sectors, including health, income, housing, labor, justice, transportation, and environment. We need to create cities that I believe are deliberate in their actions and planning to address the needs of those communities and populations that are marginalized and disadvantaged because of their social location to participate in civic life and civic society. And Ranu's presentation talked about the closure of schools And for some, the closure of schools is about the economy of size. So we have large buildings where there isn't the same group of numbers of students to occupy that space, but without an analysis about the underpinning of when you remove that school, how you also remove the opportunity for community building, and who does that impact. I believe as well that we need to, and David Miller identified this, that we need to be in a city where we welcome and create spaces for meaningful exchange and dissenting views. And that this site, the city, needs to be, I think, a place of contestation. Because I think out of that really often comes the kind of innovation, the kind of ideas that give birth to this kind of center. Because nobody just came up and handed it to you, yes? I heard that there were deliberations, there were petitions, and there were back meetings, you know. So we know that out of those kinds of dissenting and contestation, that good things happen. Some of the examples that I would highlight of that kind of work that has happened in this city, and I'm speeding, Jane, is we saw recently where physicians and healthcare workers across this city mobilized every year since June 2012, when the federal government cut access to funds for refugee healthcare. So we all mobilized annually in front of buildings in this city, and I think it was because of that why we kept the issue on the agenda, and why when the opportunity came for Canada to be really responsive to the Syrian refugee crisis, that we in fact still had a system that we could call on to be responsive. I believe that this activism and this action of the city was also exemplified in the Idle No More movement, when Indigenous peoples and allies took over the Eaton Center and Dundas Square, demanding accountability for murdered and missing Indigenous women, treaty recognition, land claims, lack of resources, and unequal funding for services such as education and housing. These are things that are possible in cities. I think we've also seen in my own work, the work of cities in the creation of, and in our advancing of the creation of supervised injection services in Toronto, led by Public Health and our health center and another community health center in Toronto's East End. And we're doing so in this city because we believe that there must be space in our city for folks who are poor, substance using, who are entitled to harm reduction services, because we believe their lives matter. We've also seen this city create what we call Sanctuary City, where Toronto City Council passed a motion to enable folks who are undocumented, who are non-status, to be able to access city services without having to provide proof of identification of residency. I think there is another step to go, which is back to the comment by David Miller around enabling folks who are resident to vote, to actually have a different kind of influence around city representation and government. We've also seen the city recently move to advance action around the creation and response around a poverty reduction strategy, again responding to the local needs because they have seen the local gaps. I want to kind of comment here, and I'm jumping forward a bit. I want to comment here specifically on the presence of anti-Black racism as one of the city's present and continuing challenges. We are in yet another moment and another wave of mobilization against racism and police violence, spotlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement. Canada is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and its Article 13(1) states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state." Yet we have the practice of carding, which is denying Black youths, particularly young Black men, from this right. We need to tell all the mayors, the police chiefs, the police services boards, and our premier that regulating carding is not a sufficient response in this city. We need to tell our decision makers that the Black body, by its mere presence, is not a threat to the city to be met with brutal force. The past City of Toronto Poet Laureate from 2009, Dion Brand, wrote of the 1978 police shooting of Buddy Evans and months later Albert Johnson, quote, "The day of the rally, not a cop showed up in uniform and the police station was locked and ghostly." This is the police station, not just at Marley and Eglinton. "We wanted to break the doors down and Dudley said no," referenced Dudley Laws. When Albert Johnson's sister sang, "By the rivers of Babylon, water came to our eyes," we've been weeping ever since. One killing after another, one police acquittal after another. At the recent Black Lives demonstration on September 23rd, I overheard one young activist noting to an elder who had commented how the elder is commenting how she remembered protesting in front of the police headquarters some 30 years ago, and how good it was to see the activism of this group of young Black people. The young woman reflected that she did not want to come back to this site as an elder to witness her grandchildren echoing the same calls for justice. I believe realizing this wish, this hope, is our collective responsibility to work to ensure that this group of young Black activists will not 30 years from now come back as elders calling the state to affirm that Black lives matter. I want to suggest for our work that we need to acknowledge the presence of everyday and systemic racism and discrimination, and how that is based on race, ethnicity, and how particular communities are affected differentially in their social benefits, in their access to support, and in their provisions of services. I will move quickly through. So yes? You're sure, Jane? Because you gave me notice. So I believe it is, if it helps individuals and system to hear and dull the sting when we use the term racism, then let's talk about and let's agree that what we're talking about is the existence and operationalizing of white privilege in Toronto. I believe that we must agree that white privilege is alive and well and pervasive. Public policy and systemic practices have acknowledged this when TDSB looked at issues like streaming and the achievement gap, when the police acknowledged this, when we looked at issues of racial carding and profiling. And statistics have confirmed this in the areas of employment when we look to public policy years ago when we created the employment equity legislation, and currently when our present premier now created an anti-racism directorate. I would suggest to you that anti-Black racism is a public policy issue for this city, with serious implications for our system, both at the community and institutional levels, in the justice system, in the child welfare system, in the employment system, and in the education system. In conclusion, spotlights of innovation and specialized programs and projects are important, but in a city, if we desire to build and maintain a really robust and responsive system, the work of addressing disparity in access to resource, attachment, and entitlement to the good life cannot only be a pilot, cannot only be a project and a satellite that seeks to individualize the problem of marginalization and sanitize the harsh reality that systemic inequalities due to poverty, discrimination, immigrant status, and colonization presents. I believe much is possible for us if we take this approach to all that we seek to do to make the city a more livable place and a place where we can all belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, you've been voted to just like carry on, and maybe there's a place to publish that here with the City Institute. I think that would be it's amazing. And of course, I imagine there might be questions from the floor about what happened today with Black Lives Matter and implications. All right. But it's now Doug Saunders' term, and as you probably know, because it's probably required reading on a number of course packages, this is a man who's written some books, Rival City being the big hit, and followed up by The Myth of the Muslim Tide, and of course we know him as the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. He's also served as the paper's London-based European bureau chief for a decade and has written extensively from East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and North Africa. He has won the National Newspaper Award, which is kind of like Canada's counterpart to the Pulitzer Prize, on 5 occasions. Yeah, you could say he's influential. But that would just be a boring way of saying he's more like the Justin Bieber of... foreign policy reporting. And you wonder why I say that. And it's not because he has Beatle boots on that are really cool, shiny patent leather. Yeah, it's because Doug has 31.6 thousand followers on Twitter, and he's clocking out at 84,000 tweets, which is pretty prodigious. Yeah, I did. So that's more than influential in foreign policy circles. It's policy wonk superstardom, actually. And, okay, Justin has 78 million followers, but Doug has 31, but Justin's only written 30,000 tweets. And let's face it, he didn't write them, and Doug writes his. So please welcome Doug Saunders.
Thank you, Jane, for hyping me up. And that said, despite all that hyping up, it's not going to be very easy to follow these two or to offer anything that has as much meat on it as what you've just heard. You can sort of regard me as the sorbet that gets served between the more substantial courses, because my gratitude to the City Institute and to the scholars here is because my relationship with them so often takes the form of them doing work that takes them years and enormous amounts of field research and preparation, and me spending 2 days reading it and finding one good line from it for a book or an article or something like that, and stapling it to some narrative of my own that's tangentially related to the purpose they've intended for it. And in that spirit, if there's a way I can bring together the things you've heard and the things you will hear about what we are very broadly calling the crises of Toronto, let me try to do that in a personal and narrative way, because I've been thinking about the things the tensions that are facing Toronto now. And I lived here in the 1980s and part of the 1990s, and then I lived away in the United States and then in Britain until end of 2012. And the city sort of, something funny happened in Toronto. There's like a figure background reversal between those two periods. Somebody cited David Holchansky's famous Three Cities report and the reversal that happened then. And maybe I can tell the story about the very first piece of journalism I ever wrote, which was in 1990, and I was a student here at York University, and I'd had no interest in journalism. I was studying international relations, and I had lived up here and got to know people in Downsview, but then by that point I had moved downtown because that was where it was at, and I took the 106 bus. And I lived between Bathurst and Christie Streets, north of Bloor Street, which at that time was no man's land. It was all Chinese and Italian and Portuguese immigrants living around there at very poor lives, and in houses that they'd bought for $10,000, $15,000 in the 70s. And for a student to live there, people would say, well, beyond Bathurst Street, you live like a Palmerston area. There's nobody lives out there. That's beyond the edge of the world at that time. And of course, what was happening around me then was what we think of as the classic 20th century Toronto settlement pattern, which was that people, usually from some rural place in a country somewhere else had moved in patterns of chain migration to these districts of downtown Toronto and used the cheap property and their gains in equity from the rising value of that property and from the enterprises they set up in it to build themselves social and actual capital and move outward from that place uptown. And that pattern of downtown to uptown settlement was just kind of coming to an end at the point when I was living there. Anyway, that side of the equation was not what caused me to get into journalism. I had read, there'd been a hoopla in the student newspaper here about something that the mayor of this place, which was then called North York, he was a guy named Mel Lastman, had called Operation Dirty Harry, which was a law that said that any house that had more than 2 people in it who were not related to each other would be declared an illegal rooming house, and they would be evicted by force. Maybe not literally have like a 44 pointed at their heads. I mean, the Dirty Harry, I hope, was metaphorical, but it was a tough law designed. And there was an outrage about that because, of course, a lot of students lived in rooming houses and didn't tend to be related to each other, and people didn't like that. And finally, Mel Lastman and his deputies came up and said, "Don't worry, folks, this doesn't apply to students at all." And then everybody dropped it. And I kind of I thought, what's going on here? So who does this apply to, if not to students? What's going on here? Why have you dropped this? So I asked my friend Cheryl Bird, I said, how do you write a newspaper article? She said, well, you do this, you go find someone and you interview them and you do this and that. And I talked to a guy I knew who ran the campus radio station here named Matt Galloway, and he said, yeah, this is what you do and that's what you do. So I went and I talked to a bunch of North York counselors. I said, who is this intended for if it's not for students? Who are these illegal rooming houses? And they said, quite explicitly on the record, they said, this is because we do not want immigrants in North York. We do not want low-income immigrants. They should not be living north of Eglinton Avenue. And they're trouble. They pee on people's lawns. That was the precise phrase used. And we are trying, and this was the chairman of the committee behind this, and we're trying to do everything we can to ensure that we don't have any forms of housing here which will attract low-income immigrants to settle here, and that our transportation strategies will prevent that type of settlement from happening in beautiful North York. Downtown Toronto is the place for low-income people and immigrants, and North York should be a nice, safe beach community, and whatever phrase they were using at the time. And I wrote that, and it was forgotten and all that. But thinking back to that, and of course it caused me to have a career in journalism following from that. But thinking back to that was the beginning of the DNA of what has caused a lot of the things that are now the crisis in Toronto. It was built of a set of inner suburban municipalities. And I've often argued that Toronto is a city built by its suburbs. There was never really a center historically, and most of the settlement occurred in what we consider the suburbs, and the suburbs kind of built the center inward, often had more power, and they built it in specific forms and so on. And when amalgamation finally occurred many years too late and nowhere near extensively enough, it was left with the pieces from this. It was left with a built form and a physical space and a set of transportation features structured to prevent various forms of human settlement from occurring. What you just heard about from David Miller about the transportation, with a 2.5-hour ride from Melbourne to Pearson Airport, that was a consequence of the decisions made in those years and in those decades as the suburbs built Toronto. A lot of the dangerously low density housing and development that we saw there. I mean, it's heroic the way what I call when I lived in Downsview briefly, we called it the one-story building capital of the world, because everything took place in one-story buildings. There's now some, like this one, some more than one-story buildings, but it was the land of the one-story building. And what you see now is what I'd call the one-story building arrival city complex and so on, where people form networks of mutual support based on place of and culture of origin in these one-story mini malls that are not ideally suited. I mean, it's not like the sort of Kensington Market ideal, the romantic ideal of the settlement. But don't forget, during the key period of Kensington Market's great activity, everyone hated it and thought it was ugly and disgusting as well. And it only functions as a nice, customer hub because it has a multi-story parking garage in it, because most people drive to it. And I think much the same way we think that about the one-story mini mall urbanization, we're witnessing its great flowering now. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. What we've seen is an end to that period when I was living in the Christie Pitts area, when it was the place where you could come from a village and you move your family from a mud floor to the middle class through a place like that, to an era where settlement's much more difficult. I've argued before that during the last 5 decades, ending in maybe 2000, Toronto got lucky. It had the right places for people arriving there, the low property costs, the fairly lax approach to zoning and control of space, and places for people to settle that were adjacent to consumer markets that could provide them with a basis for settlement. But during the next 50 years, we can't be lucky. We're going to have to be skilled because we do not have the ideal spaces for people. People settle in places that are not well aligned to the forms of urban politics and transportation that exist. Peel region is the main place of immigrant settlement, including low income immigrant settlement, not just in Ontario, but in Canada. About half of all immigrants to Canada settle in Peel region. It's the largest place of immigrant settlement in North America, except perhaps Los Angeles. And we've just seen a transit debate between Markham and Mississauga, was it? In which they turned down billions in provincial money to allow Brampton, Mississauga. They turned, you guys all know this, they turned down billions in provincial funding to allow the sort of transportation link that could solve the type of problem that David Miller alluded to, and so on. We have a very dangerous mismatch between the new settlement spaces, which are all suburban. And this is something that Toronto now has in common with everywhere in the world. Poverty and immigration are now phenomena that take place in the suburbs. Almost everywhere. Almost every city in North America, most of the big cities of Western Europe now as well. And we're still grappling with that. Places that were built to be bedroom communities for people with cars, that were planned by people who thought they didn't want poor immigrants because they pee on the lawn, who set up laws to prevent the formation of communities of people who weren't related to each other and so on, are now the places where people are trying to make their start. And we have not yet come to terms with that. I think the politics, the municipal politics, the mayoral politics that we saw during the last few years were a consequence of that. We saw a form of extremist populism driven by marginalized, low-income, usually minority people in the inner suburbs, that still has not gone away with the departure of that mayor. We have not addressed the political consequences of those spatial decisions that I witnessed in 1990. We have not come to terms with the transportation consequences yet. We've not come to terms with the polarization along racial lines, along economic lines, along lines of immigrant and settled among class lines that are increasingly becoming consequences of that. So if I could take it back to York University in 1990, we were seeing the beginning then of a reversal of the pattern in Toronto, but also of all of the things that we're going to have to face now, and the multiple crises of Toronto that you've heard about now, that you'll hear about some more, and that I'm sure you're all aware of. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right. We are rounding the bend here. Feel free to get up, grab a drink, whatever you need to do. It's just talking from the front of the room. I am absolutely certain that Councillor Wong Tam is quite familiar with people while she speaks, milling about, and she's a very steady hand at the mic. So if you need to refill or deplete, you know what to do. It's 8:10 about. We're going till 9, so we're going to have one more set of comments, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So, to introduce Councillor Wong Tam, of course, you would know that she has served as the Ward 27 Centre Rosedale Councillor since 2010. She has an extensive career investing in the City of Toronto through both the public and private sectors. Her contributions have led to the development and support of numerous social planning programs, business ventures, art endeavours, successful community initiatives, and Councillor Wong Tam has a distinguished track record of human rights advocacy. She was co-founder of Asian Canadians for Equal Marriage, the past president of the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter, and has helped successfully lobby the federal government for the head tax apology and redress. Remember that? That was awesome. And she's progressive, urbanist, unapologetic champion of all things Toronto, and she has how many thousand tweets? 28,000.
Thanks so much, Jane. And I want to thank the City Institute for the invitation to participate in this illuminating panel discussion. I don't know if David is still, David, you are still here. Before you leave, I just want to give a shout out to you, just because, people have asked me since I got to City Hall in 2010, they've said to me, how's it there? And of course, my first 4 years was under Rob Ford, and my most recent 1.5 years is under John Tory. And I said, I think it's much better under John Tory. Things are civil, and we're much more organized. We're somewhat, working together. I don't agree with his politics on most things, but that's okay. At least I can have a civil discussion with him and respectfully disagree. And they said to me, so you still haven't experienced good times yet? And I think to myself, what would good times be? And I hear David Miller speak, and I actually sit in my chair, and I think to myself, that would have been a really good time, is to serve with that man as mayor. Now, I'm going to put forward a proposition. In 2018, I think if we're going to say that perhaps Doug Ford might run for mayor, he's playing coy right now, but all things are, as I see them, is that we're probably going to see a Ford on the ballot. And I think that if we see John Tory on the ballot, he's almost guaranteed a second term, but if we think back to 2014, if Olivia Chow's campaign did not collapse, we could have seen a progressive mayor come up the middle. Just putting that out there in case that interests anyone in the room, right, David? Okay, there's an opportunity. So, but it is nice to see you again, David. Thank you very much for being here. Matt Kelway, I'm just going to acknowledge your presence. I know that you worked incredibly hard trying to build an urban agenda for the New Democratic Party. I recognize that the outcome of the last election is not as you had hoped, and I'm holding the Liberal government's feet to the fire that we want to see that urban agenda come forward, and that urban agenda has got to address the issues of inequality, and that has to be front and center of any federal government, because we still don't have a national housing policy despite a lot of talk. It's early days, so I'm hoping that we'll see that. There are lots of people who wanted to see a national childcare policy come out of the federal government, and I recognize, again, it's early days, but there are a lot of things that we want out of the federal government, gestures coming from Ottawa that have to go beyond selfies, I must say. So I'm just going to speak very, very briefly, because there's been so much that's been said, and I'm not an academic. I kind of want to speak from the heart, because I figure if I speak from the heart, then you kind of know where I stand. We live in a great city, and I know that we can paint this picture of doom and gloom, and certainly I get, depending on where we stand, it is a pretty miserable place at times. But I don't want to focus necessarily on all the things that are wrong with this city, because there are some good things. And some of the good things of the city, and I'm going to just say, is that despite the fact that we have the model that diversity is our strength, and I know that there are going to be some challenges to living up to those words. When I travel abroad and when I come back home to Canada, we have something very special in this country. And I think that we have something very special in Toronto. And Toronto is what you want Canada to be. And Canada is what you want the rest of the world to be, because other orders of government have traveled to Toronto to study how we manage this diversity, how we actually foster this discussion around inclusion. And it's not necessarily straightforward, and there's so many more gradations in between and subtleties of how we need to address it. But I know that we have to have those tough conversations, and I know that those tough conversations need to include everyone, and they can't only take place at City Hall, because it doesn't work if it only happens at City Hall. City Hall is a bit of an echo chamber. I see the same 2,000 residents who are empowered to come out to speak on their behalf, and those stakeholders are oftentimes where we spend our greatest concentration of resources consulting with these same 2,000 residents. The conversation that we have to have, and the tough conversation around bridging that income inequality, making sure that people feel included, means that we have to go out into the neighborhoods, and we have to speak in the languages that they speak in, and we have to provide childcare, and we have to make sure that people, whether they're in church basements or perhaps they're in the mosques or temples, that's where we have to go. It actually, there's no shortcuts around this, and that's hard work, and that's the pattern of behavior that is not happening at City Hall. So it's not a matter that we have to think outside the box. I advocate that we have to smash the box. The box doesn't work. And if we actually only think about, just doing a little bit of innovation, just reaching a little bit until it doesn't feel so comfortable, then we're never going to get to that place where we're going to have that true conversation of equality where we shift the system. And that means that the system has to be shifted greatly to make sure that everyone else is included. There was a lot that was said tonight. And I knew that as I was speaking as the last speaker, and I knew that coming up here, by the way. It's really hard to find this building. Wayfinding, I want to advocate for more wayfinding at York University. I knew that there was going to be a lot of rich discussion, and I wanted to make sure that I was not going to repeat what was already going to be said. And as I heard David speak and our panelists speak, they covered just about everything. I want to share with you a little piece of Ward 27 and what we have to go through in Toronto Centre, Rosedale. I've got 90,000 residents in my ward. They're registered to vote in Ward 27. Those are our residents. During the daytime, my population goes out 4 times. So literally it quadruples because we're a major employment zone. And what that means is that there's always this perception of wealth. You guys think we're big and powerful downtown, right? And of course I would be sitting in the heart of the wealthiest people in the country. I did mention I represent Toronto Centre, Rosedale. What you don't know about my communities is that they're divided into 14 residential pockets and five distinguished business areas. So not only do I represent the 1% of the 1%, and we're talking about the people who are going back 7 generations of colonization. Like, I know exactly where they are. I know where their houses are, and they've got very large homes. And I've actually said this to them. I don't speak differently going north of Bloor or south of Bloor. It's the same conversation. And so I do represent the 1% of 1%. I also have one of the poorest postal codes in the country in Ward 27, Toronto Centre, Rosedale, and that's in downtown East. So you'll know it as neighborhoods described as Moss Park that are bounded in neighborhoods that on the west side of Regent Park. I have over 1,000 shelter beds in my ward alone, which makes it the #1 capital in Toronto with respect to homelessness. I also have the largest Aboriginal population in our city, and we know that the numbers that the Aboriginal community, the statistics that the Aboriginal community are facing are quite dire. I also have an area in my city, in my ward, that is the Church and Wellesley Village, which you would think as, if you sort of go by the stereotype of the powerful pink dollar, you think all we do is like to, shop and drink and party our little faces off during Pride, which is not untrue, but that's only 7 days. But what you also, when you peel back, what you also recognize is that we also have the largest number of unemployed people in Ward 27, living in the Church and Wellesley corridor. So there are so many other subtleties to understanding what is in downtown Toronto that don't get addressed when we're in a political environment that is so polarized between downtown and suburban realities. There is no room at City Hall talking about what we are facing in downtown Toronto. Not to say that we don't have a subway. Yes, we have a subway, and we do have access to, to good food markets, so we're not a food desert. So yes, we won't get that type of attention, but I can assure you that we've got some very big problems right downtown in the heart of our city. If you go down to George Street, which is where Seton House is located, I've got the second largest men's shelter in this country located on George Street. And there are conditions on George Street that you will not find anywhere across the city, even the poorest neighborhoods in inner suburbs. That is just a reality that we live with in downtown Toronto. But we don't get a lot of time talking about that or understanding what the impacts that we have to deal with who are elected to represent downtown's pockets, because right now there just isn't oxygen at City Hall. There's barely any oxygen in even print or social media avenues because it doesn't fit into a neat and tidy little box of suburbs versus downtown. And so I'm just gonna put that out there for you because you're all urbanists. You're big city thinkers. And when you do your research, and I know the research is the fuel for advocacy, because chances are it's going to inform the policy that we end up debating and considering and drafting based on your research. Like, you know it as well. I would just advocate that you don't overlook the pieces that have been overlooked for a very long time. And those are the communities of residents who live downtown, where we have a single bachelor condominium, because you're right, people have moved out. But there are lots of people who haven't, and those folks are living 3 to 4 people in a bachelor apartment, and all I see when I go door knocking during the election time is students and the elderly, and people living with mental health, opening their door, and I can see curtains dividing a bachelor apartment as people try to make the most of a very expensive downtown. And they're not going anywhere. They can't go anywhere. It's already hard enough to be where they are, and that's where their systems of supports are. So I'm just going to leave it there because you may have some good questions. If you don't, then I will stick around and be happy to speak to you. But I do want to say, just to conclude, to be quite honest, is that we have an opportunity to build a better city. And I know that in my neighborhood, I have Ryerson. All of Ryerson University is in my ward, so I deal with Ryerson extensively, and a good chunk of University of Toronto just sits on the other half of my community. So I end up representing 1.5 universities. I don't get to interact as much up here at York University, but I've been following your research, and you guys are doing some spectacular things. I'm going to encourage you to reach out and work with us, because at the city level, we actually need to hear these voices. The language that was used by our 3 panelists, my God, that is never, ever used at City Hall. I barely hear that language and this type of quality research at our committee levels, and yet that is where policy is driven. And so if we don't back that up, I'm going to be left with the same articulation from the same 2,000 residents who come out to speak, and that means it's going to be really hard to change anything without your active participation. Thank you very much. Thank
you. Okay. There's been some back and forthing with the organizers here. The vibe is it's been spectacular. Beautiful things have been said. The event started late because everyone was pretty social and wanted to talk. There's a sense that maybe we want to get straight to the hamburgers and no Q&A. How would you feel about that? And that you could meet their game. They want a hamburger. They've more than earned it. So if you're okay with that, please approach the bench with hamburger in hand, and you'll get questions answered. Yes, and yes, the band is coming. They're going to set up. We're going to hear from the Citizen, I believe it's called. Yeah, rock on. Get your burger. Thank you very much.
Keeping us steady, Caracello. So we're going to play a few tunes for you. I want to remind ourselves of the fact that we weren't just born out of urban research. There were two other passions that, except for very, very elegant German shoes, which were worn in the office by a lot of people, Ahmed, there were two passions that also were shared by a lot of people. One of those passions was football. We won't talk about that today. And the other passion was music. And we thought, since we started that way, we're going to celebrate that way. So we're back here with our band, which you've seen, some of you, in different incarnations. So in the summer of 2005, when we were putting the City Institute together in the first application for research, which ended up in between city research, the Finch washout happened. But just before the Finch washout happened, Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans, which was a much worse catastrophe than the Finch washout, but set the stage for a lot of the research that we were doing afterwards. So, in honor of Hurricane Katrina, we're going to sing you a song about New Orleans.
Illinois Central Monday morning rail, and 15 cars and 15 restless riders, 3 conductors, 25 sacks of mail, all along the southbound Odyssey. The train pulls in from Kankakee and rolls along past houses, farms, and fields, and passing towns that have no name, and freight yards full of old black men, and the graveyards of the rusted automobile. Good morning, America, how are you? I say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. And we're playing cards with the old men in the club car. A penny a point, and there ain't no keeping score. And pass the paper bag that holds the bottle. I can feel the wheels grumbling beneath the floor. And the sons of the poor man porters and the sons of the engineers ride their father's magic carpet made of steel. And mothers with their babes asleep go rocking to that gentle beat, and the rhythm of the rails is all they feel. Good morning, America, how are you? I say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. It's nighttime on the city of New Orleans. and we're changing cars in Memphis, Tennessee. We're halfway home and we'll be there by morning. Through the Mississippi darkness, rolling down to the sea. And all the towns and people seem to fade into a bad dream. And the steel rail, they still ain't heard the news. The conductor sings his song again. The passengers will please refrain. This train's got the disappearing railway blues. Good night, America, how are ya? I say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. Thank you.
Since all Canadian bands need a lot of people on stage, I'm going to ask on stage now Sean Parker and Maddie Wood.
So if you know Roger at all, and most of you do, you know that this is absolutely the song that Roger was born to sing.
Sure you will. In the suburbs I learned how to drive, and you told me you'd never survive. And the other skis were leaving. You always seemed so sure that one day we'd be fighting this urban war. Your part of town against mine, we'd be standing on the opposite shore. But by the time the first bombs fell, we would be already born. We were already born. Sometimes I can't believe it, I'm moving past the feeling. Sometimes I can't believe it, I'm moving past the feeling again. Kids wanna be so cruel, but in my dreams we're still screaming through the yard. Sometimes I can't believe it, I'm moving past the feeling. Sometimes I can't believe it, I'm moving past the feeling and into the night. And knew why I wandered order when I'm still young. I can hold her hand, show her some beauty before all this damage is done. But if it's too much to ask, if it's too much to ask, then give me a son.
Sometimes I can't believe it. I'm moving past the feeling.
Sometimes I can't believe it. I'm moving past the feeling
Again, I'm moving past the feeling again.
I'm moving past the feeling again. Yeah, sorry for messing that one up.
Hey.
Okay, mandolin.
All right.
I can hear you. So this is a transit song. See if I can remember the words. Cheat sheet in case I forget the words. Yep.
I'm doing anything because I'm
Yeah, I'll look at you when you do the longer solo, especially, okay? And then do the second at the end of the second that second chorus. Remember? Okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. Outside, another yellow moon has punched a hole in the nighttime, yes. Climbed through your window and down to the street. I'm shining like a new dime. The downtown trains are full with all those Brooklyn girls. They try so hard to break out of their little world. You wave your hand and they scatter like crows. They have nothing that can capture your heart. They're just thorns without a rose. Be careful on them in the dark. And if I was the one you chose to be your only one, well, can't you hear me now? Can't you hear me now? Will I see you tonight? On a downtown train, where every night is just the same. You leave me lonely now. I know your window and I know it's late. I know your stairs and your doorway. Walk down your street and past your gate. Stand by the light of the four-way. You watch them as they fall. They all have heart attacks. You'll stay at the carnival, but they'll never win you back. We'll see you tonight on a downtown train, where every night is just the same. You leave me lonely now. tonight on a downtown train where all my tears just fall like rain. On a downtown train, on a downtown train, on a downtown train, on a downtown train.
Thanks a lot.
All right, so partly because if we don't do Dylan, they'll take away our folk music license. But also, this song in particular is kind of an important urban social movement anthem, and we'd like to dedicate it to the Black Lives Matters protesters. They say everything can be replaced. They say every distance is not near. So I remember every face of every man who put me here. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released.
They say that every man must fall, yet I can see my reflection way above this prison wall. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released.
Now yonder stands a man in this lonely crowd, a man who swears he's not to blame. And all day long I hear him shouting so loud, just crying out that he was framed.
I see my light come shining from the west down to the east.
And
Any day now, any day now, I shall be released. I see my light come shining be released.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.